Hi, my name is Amy Murphy, and I am the founder of Rehumanize International. We are a secular, nonpartisan organization dedicated to creating a culture of peace and life. Today, I want to talk about euthanasia, assisted suicide, and filicide. There are ubiquitous things that are considered just part of the human experience. Perhaps you've heard the idiom that was popularized by Benjamin Franklin. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain, save for death and taxes. But prior to death, for those of us who make it over the age of 50, disability and severe illness will probably be a part of our human experience too. There's the riddle, what walks on 4 legs at sunrise, on 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs at dusk? The answer is humans. We begin crawling on all 4s. We're dependent, we rely on others to clean ourselves and to feed ourselves. In the prime of our lives, we'll be able to walk on 2 legs, usually without assistance. Sometimes we can run, sometimes we can even feed and clean ourselves without needing much help. At this point in our lives, we often become comfortable with the idea of independence as the norm. However, as we get older and we age, we will sometimes need mobility aids like wheelchairs or canes, there's that 3rd leg, or rollators like me. When we get older, we might also need assistance with feeding and cleaning ourselves or getting around. At the beginning and at the end of our lives, we live in this sphere of interdependence where we rely on others in a way that is more palpable and perhaps more visible than in the prime of our lives. Humans begin our lives in a condition of interdependence and vulnerability. Yet in these stages, we are still fully, completely, wholly, and unchangeably human. Unfortunately, there is a common form of dehumanization and oppression that often targets those of us with disabilities: ableism. Ableism is responsible for a number of deaths by euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in our recent decades. Can you imagine being starved and dehydrated for days on end until your throat was so dry that it cracked, or your stomach was so empty that you craved even the smallest morsel of food? Imagine if this was done to you by your medical team, by the people who are responsible for caring for you in your most vulnerable state. This sort of horrific ableism was not only allowed, but even ordered by a judge in the horrific case of Terri Schiavo, who was starved and dehydrated to death in 2005 following a traumatic brain injury that she had suffered years earlier in a car accident. Dr. Ronald Cranford, a physician for Michael Schiavo, said in an interview with Sean Hannity, "Patients in a persistent vegetative state, as well as the profoundly disabled, lack personhood and consequently have no constitutional rights." And Judge Greer, the one who insisted that Terri be starved and dehydrated to death, said, "The real issue in this case, however, deals with treatment options for Terri Schiavo and whether or not they will have any positive effect so as to significantly improve her quality of life." Attorney David Gibbs responded by saying, "What Judge Greer was, in effect, saying was that no matter what condition Terri was in, or even if the family could teach her to swallow, to drink on her own, instead of using a feeding tube, that nothing could prove to Judge Greer that any treatment would raise Terri's quality of life to the level where he would believe Terri would want to stay alive. The ableism is pervasive. The idea that any human's life isn't worth living is a profoundly privileged and ableist idea. Or consider this more recent story that really highlights the horrific ableism pervasive in our society. In 2020, a man in the United States was starved and dehydrated to death and refused any sort of treatment for COVID-19, which he had contracted, because his medical team deemed that he didn't have a high enough quality of life. They unilaterally made the decision to kill him, even though his wife was fighting back. Ableism devalues the lives of those with disabilities like Terry or Michael, or even like myself, with conditions like hypermobility spectrum disorder and fibromyalgia. Ableism might have us drawing stark lines between different types of disabilities. Things like visual impairment or diabetes are so common, yet the treatments for them have been made so widely available that in our modern culture and even in the medical community, they're not really thought of as disabilities anymore. Yet we probably all know someone with a glucose monitor or someone who wears glasses. And even 100 years ago, the treatments for those disabilities were much rarer, to the point where people with visual impairments or diabetes would be facing a much more difficult life, maybe more in line with what we think of as being disabled. However, rarer disabilities, like conditions like spina bifida or cerebral palsy or paraplegia, are often whispered about in hushed tones. Oh, I could never live like that. But people with disabilities can hear you. Saying things like that is incredibly dehumanizing. And despite all of the aids that the medical community has worked to create to help those with disabilities over the years, ableism still is deeply rooted within the medical community. In 1920s Germany, jurist Karl Bindig and psychiatrist Alfred Hook published a book titled "Permitting the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Living." The text introduces the idea of the forced sterilization or even eugenic killing of those considered unfit for the growth of civic society. According to a 2018 paper on the subject, German physicians were heavily drawn into this eugenic movement with the idea that disabled people were unworthy of living. This movement, quote, drew on social Darwinism, and they argued that the burden on society by having to care for these individuals was too high and their human status too low, that the appropriate solution was the killing of these populations. The ableism in the medical community sadly still points to the eugenic abortion of disabled children in the womb, particularly those considered incompatible with life. The ableism within the medical community has physicians accepting the violence of euthanasia instead of offering kinder and more compassionate palliative care options to reduce pain and suffering for those who live with disabilities. They have come to consider the killing of disabled and severely ill patients as acceptable, even if that eugenic desire doesn't quite stem from the same malicious or genocidal aims. Euthanasia is often referred to as mercy killing, which is why euthanasia laws often apply to terminally ill patients, at least first. In the case of both assisted suicide and euthanasia, the underlying implication is that death is preferable to living a life with suffering and pain that may come from being disabled or severely ill. This ableism is found at all levels of society, not excluding the entire medical field. The term euthanasia comes from the Greek words eu, meaning good or easy, and thanatos, meaning death. Euthanasia is the direct killing of a patient by a physician or another individual. This can be voluntary, following the wishes of the patient, non-voluntary, performed even when the patient cannot consent anymore, or involuntary, or against the wishes of the patient. Assisted suicide refers to when a patient requests medical aid in dying, and a doctor will prescribe a lethal dosage of a medication, which the patient will then take on their own. Some proponents of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide will use the term medical aid in dying as a euphemism for either or both of these. Now, I don't quite respect the common distinction that is made between active and passive euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is often called euthanasia by omission and involves the deprivation of a medical treatment or food and water. This intentional starvation or dehydration, as happened in the cases of Terry Schiavo and Michael Hickson, we view as a case of active killing, not just passively allowing a person to die. Intentionally preventing someone from getting the food and water that they need to continue to survive is without question an act of intentional and aggressive violence. Additionally, the deprivation of any medication or treatment that would be constituted as ordinary care within our modern context would also be a case of active killing. For example, if a patient with diabetes is being treated, but insulin is being intentionally taken away from them, if they're unable to access their normal maintenance medication for their condition because physicians want them to die of diabetes, that would be a case of intentional and active killing. According to the literature, which explains common and recommended practices for euthanasia, euthanasia usually begins via an intravenous dose of some sort of anesthetic to numb out the patient and make sure that they don't feel anything that's coming afterwards. Eventually, the killing is actually accomplished using a class of drug called barbiturates, which are used to induce a heart attack in the individual. In euthanasia, this drug is often administered by another individual, sometimes a physician and sometimes another family member. In the case of physician-assisted suicide, the drug technically needs to be ingested or administered by the patient directly to themselves. Ironically, we also see how different forms of violence are linked when we notice that the drug used to kill in euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, barbiturates, is often also used to kill inmates on death row. Though rare, it has been recorded in several instances that there have been complications in physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, where the patients likely suffered pain before they died. Filicide is violence that is linked but is also distinct from the medical practice of euthanasia because it often occurs in the home using a variety of usually very grisly means. According to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's Anti-Filicide Toolkit, in the disability community, filicide is used when talking about a parent or other relative murdering a child or adult relative with a disability. Because it is often something that happens at home, filicide is often underreported. But according to the Disability Day of Mourning's researched materials, over 700 people have been killed by filicide just since the event began in 2012. These horrific statistics are compounded by the fact that the media often portrays filicide as understandable or justifiable because of the way that disabled people are viewed as burdensome and dehumanized. It should be obvious after viewing the mechanisms of both euthanasia and filicide that they are acts of aggressive violence against vulnerable people. Even if the stated intention is to stop the suffering or prevent further suffering of an individual, we may never kill a human being in order to end suffering. The solution to pain and suffering is to alleviate the suffering, not to eliminate the sufferer. Some argue that everyone has the right to die with dignity, and that to die in pain or suffering would be to die an undignified or degrading death. As Janet Good, an assisted suicide advocate, put it, pain is not the main reason we want to die. It's the indignity. Every client I've talked to, they've had enough when they can't go to the bathroom by themselves. Most of them say, I can't stand my mother and my husband wiping my butt. Gilles Génicot, co-chairman of the Euthanasia Control and Evaluation Commission in Belgium, said that the Belgian euthanasia law humanizes the deaths of terminally ill patients. In the view of Good and Génicot, disability and illness are things that dehumanize by making a person vulnerable and dependent on others. According to them, choosing death rehumanizes an otherwise dehumanizing death, restoring the autonomy to the patient in a case where they are otherwise dependent would be the thing that makes a death dignified. But what is this conception of dignity? According to the Consistent Life Ethic, our dignity as human beings is something that is inherent to us, something that can't be taken away by our disability or level of dependence or age. Conceptions of human dignity that are based on health or level of ability or level of independence are flatly ableist and ageist. As the disability rights group Not Dead Yet writes, in a society that prizes physical ability and stigmatizes impairments, it's no surprise that previously able-bodied people may tend to equate disability with loss of dignity. This reflects the prevalent but insulting societal judgment that people who deal with incontinence and other losses in bodily function are lacking dignity. But violence is never the answer to pain, incontinence, or disability. We should never accept violence of euthanasia or filicide or physician-assisted suicide as the response to suicidal ideation and despair. Truly, it is unconscionable when we consider that people facing suicidal ideation are treated differently based on how disabled they are. Non-disabled people are treated with suicide prevention, but people with disabilities or severe illness are often treated with suicide assistance. Mercy that sees dependence and disability as undignified is not true mercy. Mercy that aims to kill the sufferer instead of alleviating the suffering is not mercy. Instead, we need to meet those who are suffering with radical compassion and hospitality. The central question of the legality of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, we must recommend laws that prohibit the practice. Beyond this one key answer, there are many cultural and policy tactics that can help to rehumanize the disabled and end this wider culture of ableism. These include robust palliative care options, access, and policy, informed and compassionate chronic pain treatment, including access to opiates for those who aren't prone to addiction, and most importantly, anti-ableist education programs that center and highlight the voices of disabled people. To combat filicide, the inherent dignity of disabled people should never be considered as up for debate, and violence should never be on the table as a treatment for disability, especially when we consider that it is highly likely that most of us will experience some degree of disability over the course of our lives. It is vital that we stand up for the inherent dignity of every disabled person to live free from all acts of violence. To learn about ways that you can get involved in our work for human rights, please visit rehumanizeintl.org. There, you can find information on local chapters in your area and how you can join up and get involved with protests and other forms of activism. Or if there isn't a local chapter in your area, you can find information on how to start your own and make sure that the inherent rights of every human being are respected, valued, and protected. For updates, you can also follow at RehumanizeINTL on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for watching. Peace.